I faked my death to escape my marriage, but she found me years later. The relentless churn in Mark Johnson's gut mirrored the unforgiving waves of the ocean that night. He stood on the edge of a cliff, a neatly folded jacket and a note beside him, poised to execute a desperate plan. 35 years old, an age that should feel like a fresh start, was for him the bitter end to a life he couldn't bear. His only escape, faking his own death. The suffocating embrace. His marriage to Sarah, 32, had begun with the brightest of hopes, a passionate affair that burned fiercely. But somewhere along the way, her love had transformed into a possessiveness that felt like a tightening noose. Sarah's anxieties manifested as endless calls, constant questions, a suffocating need to control his every move. He still cared for her, or the woman she once was, but he was drowning. Attempts to communicate, to reason, only intensified her grip, fueled by a deep-seated fear of abandonment he couldn't soothe. Leaving her, simply walking away, seemed impossible. She would find him, hound him until he returned, or until he completely broke. His only option was absolute disappearance. The plan was meticulously crafted. A jacket, his wallet, and fabricated letters hinting at despair were left where the tide would surely claim them. A rented car, returned miles away, its tracks erased. A bus ticket to a distant city under a false name, then a train to the anonymity of a new life in the South. He watched the news from afar. The missing person report, his family's somber faces, Sarah's tear-streaked eyes on the grainy screen. Guilt, a heavy blanket, settled over him, but beneath it was a desperate, nascent freedom. He chose the quiet anonymity of a coastal town in Florida, a place where new faces blended easily. He shaved his head, grew a beard, and became David Miller. Work as a chef in a small, out-of-the-way beachside diner offered a stark contrast to his former life as a high-flying marketing executive. The rhythmic chop of vegetables, the sizzle of food, the simple demands of cooking became his tranquil routine. He learned to live minimally, always looking over his shoulder. The first few years were a tightrope walk of fear and relief. Every unfamiliar face, every slowing car, sent jolts of panic through him. He avoided crowds, kept his head down, and never spoke of his past. He missed his family and old friends, a constant ache. But the alternative, the suffocating embrace of his old life, felt worse. He clung to his freedom, a fragile, hard-won prize, living off the grid, a quiet ghost. The haunting return. Life, however, has a cruel way of delivering the unexpected. 5 years after his disappearance, 5 years into his new life as David Miller, the world decided to remind him of the past he had so painstakingly buried. He was at the local market, haggling for fresh produce, the familiar chaos of vendors and shoppers surrounding him. He turned to grab a bag of apples, and then he saw her. Sarah. She stood perhaps 20 feet away, her back to him, examining a stall of colorful scarves. Her hair was longer, a shade lighter, and she carried herself with a quiet grace he hadn't seen in years. His heart leapt into his throat, then hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to disappear into the crowd. But he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, a statue of terror and disbelief. She hadn't seen him. He ducked behind a stall, his breath catching, his mind a whirlwind of panic. How was this possible? Why was she here, in this remote corner of Florida, years after his supposed death? He spent the rest of the day in a cold sweat, his carefully constructed piece shattered. He peered from behind corners, his eyes scanning the crowds. He saw her again, later that afternoon, sitting alone at a cafe, sipping iced tea, her gaze distant. She seemed older, yes, but also different. Less frantic, more composed. The possessive edge that had driven him to such extreme measures seemed absent. Or was it simply a trick of the distance, of his own fear? He avoided the market for days, working extra shifts at the diner, claiming to be unwell. But the image of her face, the terrifying reality of her presence, haunted him. He couldn't run forever. She was here, in his new world. A cautious watch. The diner owner, Mike, a jovial man of 50 with a booming laugh, noticed David's sudden quietness. He tried to offer advice, suggesting a day off, a swim in the ocean. But David merely nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. David began a cautious, agonizing investigation. He kept his distance, always. He watched her from afar, observing her routines. She seemed to be staying in a small guest house not far from the beach. She spent her days walking, visiting local markets, sometimes sitting by the ocean for hours, simply staring at the waves. She was often alone. She seemed lonely. He learned her name was still Sarah. She worked, he overheard from the guest house owner, as a freelance travel writer, a far cry from the demanding corporate job she held in his old life. This Sarah seemed calmer, softer. But was it real, or was it a facade? He recalled the suffocating phone calls, the constant demands for his whereabouts, the subtle accusations, the silent tears designed to elicit guilt. He remembered the fear in her eyes, the desperate need for him to be only hers. That was the Sarah he had escaped. This new Sarah, quiet and contemplative, was unsettling in a different way. She made him question everything. He saw her interacting with others. With the guest house owner, she was polite and friendly. With the local vendors, she was respectful, even playful. There was no sign of the frantic, possessive woman he remembered. Had she changed? Could people change so profoundly? The thought was almost as terrifying as the discovery of her presence. If she had changed, then perhaps his extreme act of faking his death had been unnecessary. Perhaps he had destroyed his life, and hers, for a phantom of the past. The guilt, once suppressed, resurfaced with a vengeance, a bitter taste in his mouth. The unbearable choice. One evening, he saw her dining alone at a quiet, open-air restaurant not far from his diner. She ordered her usual, grilled fish and a sparkling water with lime. He remembered that order. It was exactly what she used to have. A pang of raw nostalgia hit him. He watched her from a discreet distance, hidden by the shadows of a large palm tree. She ate slowly, thoughtfully. She didn't check her phone constantly, didn't dart anxious glances around the room. She was simply present. A new, agonizing thought emerged. What if she wasn't looking for him? What if she was here for her own reasons, finding her own peace, just as he had? What if his presence, his resurrection, would only shatter her newly found tranquility? The burden of the truth became almost unbearable. He decided he couldn't let her see him. He would continue to hide, to live as David Miller, and let her live her new life, whatever it was. It was the only way to protect them both, especially her. His initial escape had been selfish, born of desperation. This new act of hiding would be selfless, a final act of love, however twisted by circumstance. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, a particularly strong storm rolled in, a sudden, violent downpour that caught everyone unawares. David was securing the diner's awnings when he saw her. She was caught in the open, trying to reach her guest house, buffeted by the wind and rain. She slipped on the wet cobblestones, falling hard, her head hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Instinct took over. He ran. He didn't think about his disguise, his new life, his fear. He just ran to her. He reached her side, kneeling in the pouring rain. Her eyes were closed, a small cut bleeding on her temple. He gently lifted her head, his heart pounding. The rain plastered his hair to his face, blurring his features. He called her name, Sarah. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dazed, unfocused at first. Then, they cleared. They landed on his face. And a slow, agonizing recognition dawned. Not just of his face, but of him. Of Mark, the shattered piece. Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, a deep, haunting pain. Mark, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, a ghost brought to life. He knew then. The game was over. All his meticulous planning, all his years of hiding, shattered in an instant. He picked her up carefully, carrying her to the shelter of his diner, the rain washing over them, as if trying to cleanse the impossible moment. Inside the small, dry space, he laid her gently on a cot. She kept staring at him, her gaze unwavering, no longer dazed, but piercing. The initial shock began to give way to a simmering anger, a profound betrayal that resonated through the quiet room. He didn't try to explain, not then. He just tended to her cut, his hands surprisingly steady. The silence between them was thick with unasked questions, with years of unspoken pain. He could see the memories flooding back into her eyes, the funeral, the grief, the years of believing him dead. And the anger was there, a deep, silent fury that eclipsed everything else. She finally spoke, her voice hoarse, raw with emotion. It wasn't a scream or a cry, it was a quiet, devastating question, the words imbued with the weight of years. "You're alive." It was not a plea for explanation, but a statement of utter disbelief and hurt. He could only meet her gaze, the guilt a crushing weight. He couldn't justify what he had done, not yet. He saw the pain in her eyes, pain he had caused, multiplied by years of false grief. Her composure, the quiet peace he had observed, seemed to shatter before his very eyes. The woman he had believed to be changed was still deeply wounded, and he was the one who had inflicted the deepest cut. The unwritten future. The days that followed were agonizing. Sarah refused to leave the diner, refusing to let him out of her sight, just as she had years ago, but this time, it was born of a different kind of possessiveness, the desperate need for answers. She sat on the cot, watching him, her eyes rarely leaving his face. He cooked for her, brought her water, but the silence remained unbroken, except for her occasional, pointed questions, delivered in a chillingly calm voice. "Why, Mark? How could you?" He tried to explain. He spoke of the suffocation, the overwhelming anxiety, the desperate need for freedom. He spoke of his love, twisted by her intense possessiveness, and his inability to make her understand. He spoke of the only escape he saw. She listened, her face unreadable, her gaze unwavering. He saw no sympathy, no understanding, only the hard, cold judgment of a woman betrayed beyond measure. He saw the echoes of the old Sarah in her eyes now, the intensity, the almost obsessive focus. But this time, it was directed at him, at the lie he had lived. He also saw the marks of the years without him. A quiet resilience, a self-sufficiency she hadn't possessed before. She had rebuilt herself, piece by agonizing piece, believing him gone. And he had just ripped it all open. He realized the complexity of the situation. He had faked his death to escape a marriage, to escape her. But in doing so, he had inflicted a far greater trauma, a betrayal that ran deeper than any possessiveness. His freedom had come at an unimaginable cost to her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she spoke again, her voice softer this time, edged with exhaustion. What now? It was the first question that didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like a plea. He looked at her, at the woman he had loved, the woman he had abandoned, the woman who had found him after all these years. He saw the scars of his choices on her face, in her eyes. He had wanted to escape, to be free. But his freedom had been built on a monumental lie, and the cost was laid bare before him. He had no easy answers. The old life was gone, shattered by his own hand. The new life, as David Miller, was now compromised, tainted by his past. And Sarah, the ghost he had brought back to life, was a stark reminder of the impossibility of truly escaping oneself. He knew one thing: he couldn't run again. The running had only led him back to her, to the very truth he had tried to bury. He had escaped his marriage, yes, but he had never escaped the consequences. The story wasn't over, it had simply shifted, from a desperate escape to an agonizing, uncertain reckoning. The waves of the ocean continued their rhythm, and this time, Mark, the man who was both Mark Johnson and David Miller, simply listened, waiting for the next impossible chapter to unfold.